Everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 28th February. Today I'm just going to be doing a brief update about Bakhmut. Won't really be focusing on anything else because this is really the most pressing part of the front line right now and I am pressed on time. So let's begin just by talking about the recent reports that Ukraine has been moving in a lot of new artillery units specifically. So for instance, you have the 47th Artillery Brigade, which has just moved in, has a lot of field artillery batteries. And there are several others that I could find on here, like the 44th Artillery Brigade. There's also the 43rd somewhere over here. I can't find it right now. But the point is that they've been moving in a lot of their remaining artillery units into the front line and around it. So maybe around Chasiv Yar, where the elevation is a bit higher and it's a bit farther away from the front line. And then they're firing their field artillery from there. And there have been some issues with supplying these units because, first of all, there are shortages in shells, and second of all, the supply routes to these forward positions are under Russian fire. They're not 100% under Russian fire control, but Russia does have the capability to strike these routes that lead to Chasiv Yar and then by extension into Ivanivske, Hromove, and to Bakhmut, which makes it harder to send shells to the front line. So that's one of the things complicating Ukraine's attempt at counter artillery, trying to counter the Russian advances. And there have been reports of counterattacks by the Ukrainians, but really for the most part they're all false. I will say though that there were attempts by the 46th Air Assault Brigade to retake the town of Dubovo-Vasilivka, probably in effort just to hold the line and pin down some Wagner assault detachments for a bit more time, just to buy them some time to send in reinforcements and artillery. But it was not successful. This was, again, just a local assault and didn't really have any sort of wide-scale effect on the front line. So all these reports that came out about pincer attacks coming from the E40 highway in conjunction with attacks to the north of Bakhmut that would envelop the forward detachments of the Wagner Group, all of that is false. There's no way that could happen at the moment, given the fact that the Ukrainians are disorganized, trying to withdraw right now. They're not in the position right now to conduct like counterattacks, especially with these units that have just suffered through months of really fierce fighting and are just trying to regroup. But let's look at what actually happened, which includes the Russians finally entering the Sobachivka district in southern Bakhmut. They took over the first blocks around the Mariupolske cemetery. They also took over some of the residential blocks and facilities that are adjacent to the Bakhmut dam. And they have also began closing in on the eastern part of Bakhmut. So beforehand, the Ukrainians had a pretty big buffer in between the front line and the Bakhmutovka River. But over the past 2 weeks or so, the bulk of Ukraine's trained units, which includes units such as the 57th Motorized Brigade, were withdrawn across the Bakhmutovka River, either by the remaining crossings or just on foot. And now there really aren't many remaining. So now we're seeing the Russians finally beginning to close in, reaching the bank of the river and starting to clear out the final houses before taking over the entire Bakhmutka district, for instance. And so you do still have some units that are on the eastern side, including some territorial defense units and some irregular units, some that are outside the regular Ukrainian army structure, some like reconnaissance units and other special units like Skala Intelligence Battalion. I'm sure that they're still on the eastern side of Bakhmut, at least to a certain extent, to conduct some sort of forward harassment attacks. Then you have some special force units like the Spartan Brigade, which I think is a part of the National Guard, which appear to be around the front lines of Bakhmut, around the northern parts. And speaking of the northern parts, the meat processing plant is currently being enveloped by the Russians because it is heavily fortified. They don't want to assault it head on. So instead of doing so, they are just attacking it from all three axes and cutting off their access to the Bakhmutovka River. That's what they're trying to do right now. And that could leave potentially a garrison of maybe 100 or so Ukrainian men surrounded if that were to pan out. Then in terms of Russia's gains in eastern Bakhmut, I'm going to sort of show what they did. They were able to take over a lot of the area around the highway that was previously under Ukrainian control. There was a bit of a bulge over here, and all of that was cleared out by the Wagner Group. Ukraine withdrew, that was part of it. A lot of the dense buildings that were near the ponds were totally cleared out, and now we're just seeing the final withdrawal of the Ukrainian forces across the river towards their more fortified, or yet to be fortified, but being fortified positions in central Bakhmut. So this includes a lot of larger governmental buildings, a lot of rail stations, apartment buildings. You can see over here, for instance, a lot of these buildings that are now being used to set up firing positions, including schools and other facilities. So they're setting up machine guns, for instance. I'm sure they're also setting up concrete sort of walls and fortifications, just trying to dig in, at least for the units that have not been able to withdraw from Bakhmut yet. These are the reports that we're receiving. Now, if we go to the north, the Wagner Group has been able to advance towards the town of Fromove. They were able to take some of the higher elevated areas that are just to the north of the town. So there is a bit of a minor hill over here. It is pretty small, so maybe it's about like 200 meters above sea level compared to the like valley around Fromove, which is like 120 meters above sea level. So there is an imbalance. But again, this hill is very small. Either way, it does give Wagner the topographic advantage, and it means that they're extremely close to the town, which is really one of the main key hubs of logistics for the Ukrainian garrison in Bakhmut, as I've went over before. So the fact that the Wagner Group is so close means that really effectively they are going to be able to fire upon whatever Ukrainian convoys are coming in and out of the city. Any sort of reinforcements or withdrawals are going to be extremely difficult, and they may even reach the town physically in the coming days, which is another big issue. If the Ukrainians want to retreat, then they may have to do it now, because in a few days, any sort of window of escape will be gone, not just in terms of the Russians firing upon their supply routes, but just physically being cut off and encircled. In terms of the forces that Ukraine has left in Bakhmut, we don't have exact numbers. There was some German article that I read that was estimating it was between 2,500 to 12,000. So that's a pretty wide range, but I do believe that's probably the case because most of the trained units have probably withdrawn over the past few weeks, not just from eastern Bakhmut, but from Bakhmut in general, towards other towns like Chasiv Yar, where they may be regrouping at the moment. And really the units that are left within Bakhmut itself are mainly just territorial defense units. There may be some foreign units, including Georgian Legion and some of the Chechen units and Russian units that are aligned with Ukraine that are still fighting within the city. But in terms of the main Ukrainian battle-hardened units that have been an integral part of their armed forces for maybe you could say 8 years, like the 57th Brigade, as I mentioned, or the 93rd Brigade, or some other units that I have listed around the water canal, most of those units have withdrawn already. Territorial defense units are some of the last remaining ones holding out, and they are doing this in conjunction with some of the special units that I listed before, like Skala Intelligence Battalion, or like the 24th Mogilev Podolsky Detachment, or the Kastus Kolinoisky Regiment. Many of these smaller irregular units. And so, yeah, the situation is becoming more and more difficult by the day. The really supply routes into Bakhmut are being fired upon more and more heavily. And this is, all in all, not a good situation for Bakhmut. So I'm going to keep you guys updated as the situation unfolds over here. So thank you guys for watching. I'll see you guys later.